Welcome to the CABC's Video Chat from Home series. I am really excited with our guest today, somebody I know really well, have worked for most of my professional career and worked with. And, I might be a little biased, but my all-time favorite U.S. Ambassador to Canada. So Gordon Giffin, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Scotty. I'm also my favorite ambassador to Canada.
We have a lot of great ambassadors from Canada and to Canada. And I know you're friends with everybody. Maybe we'll start with that. Everybody might not know that you grew up in Canada, but when you were, maybe you could talk about that as a kid. And did you ever think when you were on the suburbs of Montreal selling hockey sticks that you would someday come back as U.S. ambassador?
The answer is no. I'm not sure that by the time I left Canada, which was after I graduated from high school, I came back to the United States to go to university. I'm not sure I knew what a U.S. ambassador was, even at that stage of my life. So no, I never really aspired to being U.S. ambassador. The time that it came up, which really surprised me, was in 1994, President Clinton did his first state visit to Canada. And he called me in Atlanta, where I was practicing law, as you know, and said, I'm making a state visit to Canada. You grew up there. Why don't you come with me? And I said, well, that would be fabulous. I think that would be a life experience. But how do I do that? And he said, I have my own plane. All you have to do is get to Washington, and I'll handle the rest. So I went to Washington and showed up at the White House early one morning, and I was standing out on that West Executive Drive waiting for the transportation out to Andrews to get Air Force One. And Mike McCurry walks out and he says, Giffin, what the hell are you doing here? And I looked at him and I said, Mike, I'm a big shot. I'm a VIP on this trip. So we go to Ottawa, and it was a fabulous experience. Excuse me. And they had a seat for me at all of the formal dinners, at Rideau Hall for lunch, and then at the state dinner over across the river in the museum. When President Clinton got up and spoke, he varied from his text and was looking at me at the next table, and he said, my friend Gordon Giffin is a metaphor for the relationship between Canada and the United States. And he told a little bit about my family background. Next day, we're flying back to Washington. I'm sitting on Air Force One, and he comes back and sits next to me. And he says, what'd you think about the trip? And I literally choked up, and I said it was literally the time of my life. I can't thank you enough. And he looked at me and he said, well, maybe you ought to go back there as our ambassador. That had never crossed my mind. I now knew what one was, because I knew Jim Blanchard, obviously, who was the then U.S. ambassador to Canada. And I looked at him, and before I could answer, he stopped me and he said, you're going nowhere until after 1996 when I get reelected. So that's the first time I thought about U.S. ambassador.
That's amazing. And then so he gets reelected, and you're then on your way to Canada. Once you got there, and I served with you, just in disclosure to anybody who might not know that, and I was your chief of staff and loved that. But so I'm going to ask you questions that I think I know the answer to, but like everybody else in the world might not. So you arrive in 1997, right?
Yes.
What was the first big surprise for you? Like, what did you prepare for the job, you go through the confirmation process, you get briefed by the officials, and then you show up. And a few months earlier, you had been minding your own business as a big shot lawyer, politically connected in Atlanta, Georgia, friend of the president. But now you're the U.S. ambassador. What was that like?
Well, two things immediately occur to me, Scotty. One was the extent to which you are now in a setting where you're not controlling your own life, where others are constantly coming up with thoughts and ideas about what you ought to do and what you ought to say. And And secondly, that there are constraints, formal constraints on who you are and what you do. And the example I would give to that is in the first couple of weeks when I was there, before you arrived in Canada, I had not yet formally presented my credentials, so I wasn't yet formally recognized in Canada as the United States ambassador. I had no status. And as a result, you weren't supposed to go anywhere. You weren't supposed to go to any event or anything that was formal, because you're not yet representing in a formal way the United States government. And so for a few days, I was just fine. And then there was an event being held over at the city hall, which at that, well, it was just walking distance from it wasn't city hall, it was the county government building, and that I wanted to go to because this fella who was the industry minister, John Manley, who I had not met, I had read about, and I thought, this guy's an interesting guy. I'd like to hear him speak. He was going to speak. And so I told Marianne and others on the staff that I was going to go over there. So everybody has a nervous breakdown. No, you may not go. And that would be untoward. And I said, fine, thanks for your advice. And then 30 minutes before the event, I got up and I walked out of the embassy and I went over. And I stood in the back of the room just to get a sense of the flavor and so forth. And it was when I realized that you take the advice and you think about it and you make your best judgment on what you think you really should do and how you should do it, being prudent, respectful of the traditions and so forth. And I didn't get any demerits from any formal official in Canada for showing up in public. And I did meet John that night because he actually recognized me from the press, and he came back and shook my hand. And I said, I'm really not here. Don't tell anybody. So that was one. The other, I think the most startling thing to me was, and I don't recall if this occurred before you arrived, but was when the security team came in and said there was a threat on my life, and that they were immediately clamping down on my activity, enhancing the security, putting security on Patty and Kelly at school. And I remember sitting there thinking, I went through a whole checklist of considerations about whether or not I should take this job. Getting killed was not on the list. And so that was a very stark day.
Yeah. Well, and luckily the security detail took good care of you because you're here to tell the tale. And that's, I think people don't realize how much foreign service officers are in the world from the United States or in the world and face all kinds of peril. So speaking of that, it's got to be even harder today to represent the United States overseas. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on you've seen a lot in the Canada-U.S. relationship from being a kid in Montreal, like literally a little kid going through high school, coming back to the United States and going to college and law school and all of those things, and then coming back as ambassador. And then now ever since, you've seen lots of presidents, ambassadors, the whole Canada-U.S. relationship. What do you like? What are your thoughts about the progression? You know, we saw the bromance between Obama and Trudeau. High points, low points. Like, what are your reflections about this relationship as you've seen it and as it stands today?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've seen it go through various peaks and valleys in the way we work. And the way it works in North America. There are certain imperatives about the geography that control a portion of that context. Obviously, the proximity of the two countries mandates certain commercial activity across that border. And as you know, for decades, it's been the largest commercial relationship the United States has. But the proximity doesn't mandate the softer side of the relationship, which is the more um, emotion-based way we work together, and that ebbs and flows. Most prime ministers and most presidents understand the numbers. They know how many people cross the border, and they know whether or not it's $1 billion worth of commerce or more or less, and they can see if their actions, tariffs or restrictions at the border affect that. And so most presidents and prime ministers deal with those numerical economic issues pretty well. The thing that I would say is in the periods where the relationship works remarkably well, both for the benefit of Canada and the United States and the broader North American community, and for the world, quite literally, is when the president and the prime minister are friends, if not pals, and where they, in my terms, conspire with each other to advance our mutual interests around the world. And I think, for example, during the Mulroney era as prime minister, working with President Reagan and President Bush, he had that kind of relationship with those two presidents, clearly. And there is no doubt in my mind that Bill Clinton and Jean Chrétien had it as well. I didn't see Mulroney's up close. I obviously saw the Clinton-Chrétien relationship up close. And it does matter. Maybe not in the numbers, but it does matter in the way we, the United States, work around the world. And I was thinking about it before we connected this morning. There would be very few months go by where a 2-week period, let's say, that Bill Clinton and Jean Chrétien didn't speak by phone. Very few. And sometimes they would be speaking about casual things. Sometimes they'd be talking about politics. They were both and are both consummate political figures, and they love to talk about politics in our two countries. But oftentimes they would be talking about, again, my terms, a conspiracy about what to do at the next NATO meeting or the next APEC meeting or the next G7 meeting. And they'd be working through the dynamics of how our mutual agenda, they didn't agree on everything, and where they didn't agree, they didn't have a mutual agenda. But, they would assign each other a different world leader at the G7. Okay, I need you to get him, I need you to get her, and then when we put it together, we'll have this initiative. And it worked. It made a difference, not just in North America, it made a difference in the world, advancing our common values and interests around the world. Those calls today, I don't know for a fact, obviously I don't have a window in it, but I don't think those calls occur. I don't think the current president and the current prime minister ever talk to each other on the phone other than when an event mandates it. And so we're missing that component of the co-conspirators advancing our common interests.
And on those calls, just out of curiosity, on those calls, do you know about them because you got a readout of them, or would you necessarily be on the call listening in every time, or is it a mixture? How does that work?
I was supposed to be on the phone every time they spoke, not necessarily because I was going to make a contribution to it, but again, it's sort of the protocol of it. And I probably, you've heard this story, but the first time I didn't actually realize that, and I knew there was a call scheduled this one evening for the two of them early on in my tenure, and I was hosting a dinner at the residence, and I was busy being a host and had a couple of glasses of wine, and Marianne called me and she said, "You do realize you have to be on the phone with the president and the prime minister in 10 minutes?" And I said, "No, didn't realize that." And this was the old days of technology, and our secure phone at the residence was actually locked in a closet, really secure. And I couldn't find the key to the closet. So I'm running around now 3 minutes, 2 minutes before this phone call and I'm supposed to be on. And finally, Roger helped me find the key to the closet and I could get to the darn phone and get on the call. And I was late. And somehow this was funny to President Clinton, and he chuckled about how he hadn't advanced anything that was important until I got on the phone. So
That's
most
amazing.
of the time I was on the call. There were times when I wasn't, when it would be Bill Clinton sitting in the residence, pick up the phone, get me Jean Chrétien, and the two of them would talk, and then I'd get a readout the next day. That happened often.
So we're going to have an election here, as everybody knows. We might have a new president, we might not. So Joe Biden might finally, I think he's run a few times starting in 1988, but he might actually get elected. That's a possibility. Or he's ahead in the polls as we're taping this. What do you think he's going to be, the kind of president that picks up the phone and calls, allies, and do you think he was chairman of Senate Foreign Relations? I think of him as an internationalist. I know you know him well from your many years in the United States Senate. What do you think? I'm not trying to be too political here, but I mean, you can be political if you want. But what do you think the dynamic will be like if there's a change in government here?
Yeah, I think it's almost evident, and people get to choose which model they think is better. There's no book that says how you do this, but Joe Biden is an internationalist, and Joe Biden, just by personality, is a people person. He enjoys relating to people, and through his experience, as you pointed out, in the Senate and as vice president, I think he believes that we can't do it on our own, that we have to do what we want to achieve in our interests, with partners and with pals and with people of common values. And so I think just because that's who he is as a person, and also because he believes that's how you advance the interests of the United States, that he immediately will be doing much more outreach to critical friends and allies. And he'll get along with some better than others, although he gets along with just about everybody. But just the dynamic of it, the chemistry is such that there'll be two or three people in our traditional alliances that he gets along with a little better, and they'll become pals, and he'll conspire with them. But he will be reaching out to people much more than the current president. The current president's view, it appears, I don't know him, I don't think I've ever spoken to him, but at least from my readings, is that we can do it on our own, that we're preeminent, and that the United States is an island, and that we can just ordain outcomes without getting any help. And I don't agree with that view, but that's a view. It's just Biden's would be 180 degrees.
Well, and you've known, as I mentioned, you've known Joe Biden from way back when, in the early days in his Senate career and yours, working for Sam Nunn, and I feel like you were pretty good friends with not only him but people in his orbit, his campaign chairman, and all of that. What do you think a Biden government? Well, and Atlanta, for example, is in the national headlines for a lot of reasons, and we can talk about that. But the mayor of Atlanta, another friend of yours, has been talked about for vice president. Probably by the time this airs, we'll know who the vice president is, or may not be the mayor of Atlanta. But what do you think, based on, these are your people, you're friends with a lot of them, very close professionally and personally. What does a Joe Biden government look like? Like, who are some people we should be paying attention to, we in the Canada-U.S. relationship, that'll be particularly relevant as he builds his government?
Well, there'd be a lot of people that I can't name, so I'm a little meaning I don't know who the entire array will be. so I'm a little reluctant to predict on who will form the government. But um, it's I've thought for some time now that, as you know, I've been involved in Democratic politics, both in Georgia and nationally, for quite some time, and I'm now not a spring chicken, and so I've figured sort of my era has moved on, and I'm an observer at this stage of my career, and then all of a sudden, the guy that's going to be the nominee for president is 77 years old, which means some of his young advisors are 68 and and 70, and so it's the people that I grew up with in politics and government, which you wouldn't expect. Now there are a whole heck of a lot of young people involved as well. If you attend some of these campaign meetings on Zoom, there's a lot of young people there, without a doubt. But as you suggested, there a lot of the people that worked for Biden when he was in the Senate, a lot of the people who worked for Biden when he was in vice president are back, right? They're just back, and they have been part of the evolution of governing in the Democratic Party for quite some time. So there'll be some continuity there as a result of that. But yet, with partially because of the primaries, I mean, there are a lot of people who have come into the process from the other campaigns as well, as it should be. You run into, I mean, I was just talking to Tracy Lewis this morning. Tracy was one of the primary field directors of the Elizabeth Warren campaign. And Tracy is moving from Boston next week to come to Georgia to be the campaign director for the general election in Georgia. Well, Tracy actually worked for me in 2016 as the campaign coordinator for Michelle Nunn's Senate race. I mean, so there's just a lot of reasons. Tracy's not my age, by the way. She's not in the group of, she's much younger, but she's coming from the Elizabeth Warren campaign, is my point. And there are people from the Harris campaign, the Klobuchar campaign, all over the map. The people from Bernie's campaign. So there'll be a lot of diversity and in age and in every meaning of the word diversity involved with Biden. That said, you alluded to Steve Ricchetti. Steve obviously is a close advisor to the president. Ron Klain is. Tony Blinken on foreign policy matters. Certainly Susan Rice, although Susan is in the mix also, I think, seriously for vice president. So it'll be good because it'll be a bunch of people who know government, who have thought about governing, who have actually seen how government works, which is a distinction from the group that came in 3.5 years ago. And I'm not just picking on the current administration, but is there any chance somebody would hire an auto mechanic who had never worked on a car? That'd be a bad idea. And we hired a bunch of people who have never been in or around government 3.5 years ago, and they don't know how to run the car or fix it. And so there'll be a mixture of people around President Biden who have been there, and then a whole raft of new people with new ideas and new energy.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time. Let me I'll ask you one more thing, and then we can talk about whatever you want if you've got more time. But let me just in terms of thinking about reflecting on dear friends in government and in politics. As we're talking today, I believe Congressman John Lewis is going to be lying in state in Atlanta. There was a really, I thought, very moving moment where the caisson crossed the bridge in Selma, and then he came, of course, here to Washington. I know I know you and he were dear friends, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit um, about losing the conscience of the Congress, but also your personal congressman right there in Atlanta, Georgia.
Well, it's interesting that you said it that way, because every time I would see John, I'd walk up to him and say, "Greetings, my own personal congressman," because he was the congressman from the district in which I live. Um, a remarkable man, in an enormous number of respects. I first met John in the early 80s, I guess. I was a young lawyer here, had returned from working in the Senate for Sam Nunn, as you suggested. And a friend of mine on the city council, Debbie McCarty, called me up and said, "My friend John Lewis is going to run for Congress because White Fowler was leaving to run for the Senate." And I didn't really know John. I knew him at arm's length. I'd met him. But she says, "Come over to his house with me and sit down with him." And I went over there and I sat down with him, and in 10 minutes decided that this guy was out of the ordinary. And I hadn't really studied his history. I'm not sure I could have told you about the Edmund Pettus Bridge that day. But his delight in trying to make things better was infectious. Infectious is probably a bad word these days, but so I got involved in his campaign for Congress, and interestingly, nobody thought he could win. He was running against Julian Bond, and the consensus of the Atlanta business community was that Julian Bond was going to win. All of the bank presidents and all the big shots were for Julian Bond, and it was a bunch of us young people working for John, and obviously John ended up winning that race, and step by step, he made a huge difference. And I recall, Scotty, 5 or 6 years ago, and you were probably there, I got him to speak to the Canadian Council of Chief Executives when they came to Washington. It was actually up in a Senate hearing room, and John made the trek across the hill to come over as a favor to me to speak to them. And he gave one of his passionate speeches about making a difference, as he used to say, getting in the way. And afterwards, and I just looked out at this group of Canadian executives. Some had never heard of John Lewis, obviously, not that they should have. And they were spellbound by John. And I had all sorts of big shot senators come in. John McCain spoke, Mitt Romney spoke. He wasn't a senator at the time, but all sorts of committee chairmen. And afterwards, Bill Down, then the CEO of Bank of Montreal, walked over to me and he said, "That was the most inspirational 20 minutes I've ever spent in my life." And so it was fun to expose John to those who really hadn't thought about what he'd done, what he'd been through, and to just seeing the pictures of his life over the last week. It's been quite stunning to think about what his contribution has been to our society, our region of the country, and he's a big loss.
It's a big loss. It's a big loss. So many memories. So you expose a lot of Canadians to Americans and a lot of Americans to Canadians. I wonder I wonder if you have like a favorite story about that. I was another American who passed away recently is Charlie Daniels, the great entertainer. And I remember you had him in your front yard in Ottawa on 4th of July. I wonder if you have any other like fun moments like that of introducing one to the other.
I'll tell you a couple of those. We have Charlie Daniels' bow here, by the way, from that. He used a horsehair bow on his fiddle, and he had, like, when he'd start playing, he'd have 20 of them behind him on the stage because he'd wear through the horsehair. And I remember one of the reasons why it was a thrill to have Charlie Daniels is because his most famous song is probably the Devil Went Down to Georgia. And
Absolutely.
he was playing The Devil Went Down to Georgia, and he broke his bow and he handed it to Patty, and he picked up another one and finished playing The Devil Went Down to Georgia. So we've got that bow here, along with a big old picture of Charlie Daniels. A couple of quick stories on that. Sam Nunn, my friend and mentor, who was in the United States Senate for 24 years, retired as chairman of the Armed Services Committee, a great leader in our country, came to visit me while we were in Ottawa. And obviously in the United States, in Georgia, he's a famous figure, and I'm a lifetime staffer of Sam Nunn. So I, among other things, I took he and Colleen and Patty on the boat tour on the Ottawa River. And as you know, you go down the Ottawa River and you pass up there on the bluff the U.S. ambassador's residence. And the young girl at the front with the microphone who's doing the commentary says, up there we see the residence of the United States ambassador to Canada. You can see the flag flying. When the flag's flying, that means the ambassador's in town. And she said, as a matter of fact, the ambassador is with us today. He's sitting in the back, in the rows in the back of the boat right now. And everybody turns and they look back, and I just sort of go like that. And this fellow in front of me, in the row in front of me, turns and he says, "Are you my ambassador?" And I said, "Well, if you're from the United States, yes, I am." And he says, "Well, I'm from Tennessee." And he said, "I'm honored to be here with you." And he turns around with his camera and he hands it to Sam Nunn and he says, hey, buddy, would you take a picture of me with my ambassador? And Nunn's jaw drops. And that's one of my favorite stories, and I remind him of it quite frequently. The other, and I'll be brief, you may recall when Roy Barnes was governor, he and Marie, or in Roy's terms, Marie, came to Ottawa to visit. And it was in December, as I recall, but there was a lot of snow on the ground in any event. And we had a wonderful visit with them and did the sort of economic development things you do for a governor from a state. And as they were getting ready to leave, we were out on the front porch of the residence and saying goodbye and thanking them for coming. And while I'm talking to Roy, Marie sprints into the middle of the front yard through about 4 feet of snow and lies down and starts making a snow angel. So I'm standing on the front porch looking at the First Lady of Georgia making a snow angel in my front yard.
That's amazing.
Those momentous, I'm sure, life-changing events are somehow stick in my brain. Scotty, I can't do a conversation about our time in Ottawa though without mentioning the opening of the new embassy. As you know, we helped create, worked on, babysat the construction of what is now not new, but then was the newest U.S. embassy in the world while we were there, and that President Clinton agreed to come and dedicate that embassy, which no sitting president had ever done before in our history, to dedicate a U.S. embassy overseas. And you may recall the State Department was entirely against him coming. And I got cussed out by the Secretary's Chief of Staff. The Secretary didn't call me, but the Secretary of State's Chief of Staff called me and said they were against it. And they were going to advise against it. And I said, well, the president and I have discussed it. He's agreed to come. Unless he changes his mind, it's on the books. And she said to me, it's Madeline's building. She should decide how this is handled. And I said, no, it's my building. And the president came, as you know, and We had a wonderful, glorious day of dedicating the new embassy, and then went up to Mont Tremblant, where he made that renowned speech on federalism, standing in the province of Quebec, basically saying that separation was not something that had any intellectual underpinning. And for the President of the United States to stand in Quebec and say a unified Canada was important both to the people of Canada, but obviously to the United States, was a historic day. Never done before, and probably won't need to be done again.
Well, and to your earlier point about presidents and prime ministers being pals and that working, I seem to remember you were able to convince the president to come on that particular day to dedicate the embassy and speak at Tremblant, because didn't you promise him a golf game?
I did.
Chrétien?
I did. Yes, and after the speech, we scheduled it in a way where we got the work done before the golf game, because I was worried that the golf game would cause us to be too late for the work. So we finally get out for them to play golf. And I'm not a golfer, so I'm just driving a cart, right? Because I don't know how to golf. And so, unfortunately, I mean, this was the fall. It was October, so it was getting dark by late afternoon. I don't remember the time exactly. And so we're at the end of the ninth hole, half the course, and Mr. Chrétien looks at Clinton and says, "It's getting dark. I think we ought to just stop with 9 holes." And Bill Clinton, with me standing there, he glares at me and he says, "You promised me a golf game if I did all this stuff today. I've lived up to my part of the bargain. A golf game is 18 holes. We're playing 18 holes." And Chrétien looks at him and he says, "Bill, it's dark out there." And President Clinton looks at his lead Secret Service agent and he says, "Pull up the vehicles and light the damn fairway." And they did. And the president and the prime minister finished the golf game, and I was out of trouble until riding back to the airport. We had to take Marine One from Mont Tremblant back to Ottawa to get Air Force One. Riding back on the helicopter, we played hearts, which he always wants to play. And we were getting along great at that point until I beat him in the hearts game. And so by the time he was leaving, he wasn't sure that doing me the favor of spending the day in Canada was the right thing to do.
Oh my gosh. Well, so maybe last thought, there will be another U.S. ambassador to Canada soon enough. It could be President Trump's nominee, Aldana Voss. It could be a Biden nominee. It could be both, depending on the timing.
Yeah.
I remember you welcoming Kelly Craft, the first woman to be ambassador to the Boys Club, and then welcoming Ambassador Hillman, who was the first woman ambassador from Canada, who came after the first woman to the U.S. Do you have, and that was kind of cool to see that passing of the torch that you so graciously did for both of them.
Well, I was proud of the fact to be able to point out that the United States was the first to have a female ambassador.
Yeah, it's both countries took too long, but yes, the U.S. did eke it in, by a nose. Do you, given you've gotten a chance to know your colleagues who have served in this role? There aren't that many people who get to be ambassadors for their country. Do you have guidance, words of wisdom, thoughts that you would offer to whoever the new U.S. ambassador to Canada is, given kind of the times we find ourselves in, from pandemic to social justice to the economy to just a challenging world environment?
Well, I think the next person that occupies that job will necessarily be part of the effort to regenerate the soft side of the relationship, and to cause Canadians, not just the government of Canada, your audience is also Canadians, because a lot of what we're trying to advance as the United States in terms of our policies, both with respect to Canada and globally, you have to get the public to believe in and understand, not just the government, because democracy tends to work. And if the public doesn't agree with you, then the government's not going to agree with you. So a lot of what you do is try and deal with that. So I think my first advice would be, don't spend all your time quoting trade statistics. Too many ambassadors get up and talk about that undefended border where we sell billions of car parts to each other, and my eyes glaze over. And yes, that's important. I don't mean to suggest commerce is not important, but my advice would be, focus on the soft side of the relationship and demonstrate that you as an individual have taken the time to understand Canada. You're not just there to lecture Canadians about what the United States wants. And the demonstrating some interest in Canadian history, heritage, culture is important. So you're not perceived to just be there to lecture Canada about what the United States wants to do, because that inevitably produces the wrong result. It pushes people the wrong way, even if your logic is correct. And,
Yeah.
and the whole, again, another thing that ebbs and flows in Canada is what I call healthy skepticism about the United States. Some call it anti-Americanism. There's a lot less of that today than there was when I was in high school in Canada. I saw
Really?
it up. Well, there has been. There may be a little more skepticism about the United States right now, but there's a latent skepticism about the United States in Canada, and part of that's because we're 10 times their size and tend to want to push people around. And then I guess the last thing I would say, and each ambassador that's succeeded me, and each of us in the club, if you will, have provided advice to each successive ambassador, and I think that's of value. But one of the principal things that I always say is, you will negotiate with your own government more than you negotiate with the Canadian government, because oftentimes some well-meaning, bright-eyed person in a department in Washington wants to do something with respect to Canada that is absolutely nuts. And you have to stop it, because you're the only person who gets up every morning with the totality of the relationship with Canada in mind. And you have to exercise that authority, or no one else will, because no one else has that perspective. You're not the Secretary of State. You're not the boss of everything, but you have to recognize that you're the only one that gets up every day and knows the dynamic across the board. And just do not let some little initiative in the agriculture department to close down potato trade from PEI affect the bigger things that you're working on.
Yeah, I think that's amazing advice. I think two immediate things are going to be, how do we reopen this border safely? That's really important. And how do we deal with a buy American, buy Canadian reshoring sentiment, that's going forward. So I think that's going to be navigating the U.S. government, to your point, as much as the Canadian one.
Well, as much as we can make it be more of a, when we talk about reshoring, that we actually are recognizing that there's no shore between us and Canada. And so as a result, we're reshoring, meaning we should be able to produce goods as well as services in the two geographies and have them treated the same for those purposes. That's the way to make what we do so much more efficient. We, as you know, I mean, we've had a series of trade agreements. Each one makes it a little better, but none of them have created the complete sort of seamless efficiency that we should have to the benefit of both of us. It's not to benefit Canada or to benefit us. It benefits both of us. And that should be the perspective. And I think we can get the Biden administration to understand that.
I hope you're right. So, listen, thank you so much. This is great. It's great to see you virtually. I miss you. I wish we could see each other in person, but maybe someday.
Well, I've proven that you still have to listen to my stories even electronically.
It's great, and now the rest of the internet can listen to it. So thank you very much for this. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
Enjoyed it. Good to see you.
You too.